You think you know the Spartans, but you've only seen the shields and spears. We picture warriors standing unshaken at Thermopylae, their bronze armor gleaming, their discipline unmatched. Movies and textbooks alike immortalize them as paragons of courage, men who lived and died for honor, guardians of freedom against overwhelming odds. This is the myth of Sparta, a tale of perfection repeated so often that it feels unquestionable. But beneath the polished legend lies a reality few dare to confront, one where glory was built not just on sacrifice, but on secrets so disturbing that they still unsettle historians today. Behind the walls of Sparta's military state, boys were taken from their families at the age of 7, stripped of innocence, and thrust into the agog, a brutal system designed to forge warriors. To the world, it was training for greatness. To those inside, it was survival through cruelty, hunger, beatings, humiliation. These were not accidents, but deliberate tools of control. And yet, hidden within this system was something darker. Still, relationships between older warriors and boys, framed as mentorship, disguised as brotherhood, but often crossing lines of exploitation. What the Spartans glorified as loyalty and bonding may, in truth, have been institutionalized coercion. This is the contrast Sparta never wanted remembered. While statues and stories exalted the warrior ideal, the lived reality was a society where children were molded through fear, ritual, and intimacy blurred into discipline. The rites of passage that produced invincible fighters also scarred generations in silence. And though ancient writers occasionally hinted at these practices, later admirers of Sparta, philosophers, nationalists, filmmakers, chose to polish the myth instead, erasing the horror beneath. The central question emerges: how could a civilization so celebrated for its heroism disguise such disturbing rituals behind the mask of tradition? Was Spartan strength the product of discipline alone, or also of a system that normalized exploitation as necessity? Today, we strip away the myth and step into the shadows of Spartan society, where the path to glory was paved with brutality, and where the most forbidden secrets were hidden not on the battlefield, but in the rites of the boyhood barracks. For centuries, Sparta has been remembered as the ultimate warrior society. Ancient writers praised its discipline, modern historians romanticized its endurance, and popular culture turned it into legend. From Hollywood's 300 to school textbooks across the world, the Spartan warrior is depicted as the embodiment of courage and loyalty, a man who valued honor above life itself. The myth is seductive, a civilization where equality, simplicity, and discipline forged men into gods of war. But like all myths, it conceals as much as it reveals. The polished image of Sparta celebrates its victories and rituals of valor, while hiding the cracks beneath. We are told of their devotion to freedom at Thermopylae, but not of the enslaved helots who farmed their land in chains, ensuring warriors never had to work. We are shown statues of perfect bodies, but not the scars, left on boys whipped until they bled during initiation rites. The myth glorifies their brotherhood, yet leaves unspoken the disturbing relationships embedded in that very system. Relationships that blurred mentorship with exploitation, normalized under the guise of tradition. Part of the reason this myth endured is because of who carried it forward. Philosophers like Plato and Xenophon admired Spartan discipline, elevating their society as a model for order and strength. Later rulers, from European kings to fascist regimes, looked to Sparta as an ideal of toughness, sacrifice, and nationalism. By amplifying these qualities, admirers buried the darker truths. To them, the brutality of the agog, the subjugation of children, and the ritualized intimacy between warriors and boys were either ignored or reframed as noble. And yet, ancient sources never completely hid these practices. Writers like Plutarch hinted at the customs of pairing older men with boys, describing them as educational bonds meant to instill discipline and loyalty. But behind the euphemisms lurked a troubling reality. exploitation disguised as mentorship, dependence reframed as devotion. The very relationships praised as brotherhood may have been coercion institutionalized by the state. Still, because Sparta's military glory overshadowed all else, these details were downplayed or treated as cultural quirks rather than systemic abuse. The myth of civilization thrives on contrast, the contrast between the admired public image and the ignored private truth. To admire Sparta's courage is easier than to confront the cruelty that produced it. It is simpler to remember Leonidas as a hero than to imagine the generations of children broken by beatings, starvation, and coerced rituals in the name of strength. By burying the horrors, the myth allowed Sparta to live on as an ideal, rather than as a cautionary tale. Modern culture has continued the pattern. Films and literature depict Spartan warriors as fearless defenders of freedom, ignoring that their society thrived on oppression of the helots and exploitation within the agoge. The image of men bound by unbreakable brotherhood is celebrated as noble, when in truth it may have been forged in rituals that blurred the line between loyalty and abuse. Every retelling polishes the myth further, ensuring the horror remains hidden behind the glory. This is why the Spartan myth is so dangerous. It tempts us to believe that strength and discipline come without cost, that heroism can exist without shadows. But history whispers otherwise. The perfection we admire was sustained by practices too disturbing to fit the narrative. Practices buried beneath centuries of retelling, softened until they were no longer recognizable. And so the myth endures, a gleaming statue standing tall while the cracks in its foundation remain unseen. But to understand Sparta not as legend, but as lived reality, we must break the mask. We must look directly at the so-called brotherhood that defined their society. The rituals of mentorship, intimacy, and control that shaped boys into warriors, and the forbidden truths they disguised as tradition. At the core of Sparta's identity lay the agoge, the brutal training system that shaped boys into warriors. Beginning at the age of 7, children were ripped away from their families and thrust into a world where every comfort was stripped, every weakness punished. To outsiders, this was framed as discipline, the crucible that produced Sparta's legendary fighters. But hidden within this system was something more troubling: relationships between older warriors and boys, glorified as brotherhood, but in truth, dangerously entangled with exploitation. The Spartans themselves celebrated these pairings. An older warrior, known as the Erastes, was assigned to a boy, the Eromenos. Officially, this was described as mentorship, the elder teaching the youth courage, discipline, and loyalty. In practice, the relationship blurred into ritualized intimacy. Ancient sources describe how boys were expected to admire their mentors, to obey them completely, and to endure whatever lessons were demanded. What was called education may often have been coercion. What was celebrated as brotherhood may, in truth, have been sanctioned exploitation. Sparta was not alone in this practice. Across Greece, similar customs existed, often justified as forging bonds between warriors who would fight side by side. But in Sparta, it was not voluntary, nor private. It was institutionalized. The state itself endorsed these pairings, embedding them within the agoge as a way of ensuring that boys were bound more tightly to their warrior class than to their own families. Intimacy became a weapon of loyalty. Trust forged not by choice but by design. The Spartans argued that such relationships strengthened the military. If a boy adored his mentor, he would fight harder beside him. If he feared losing his mentor's approval, he would endure pain without complaint. But beneath this rationale lurked the reality that the boys had no say, no power, and no escape. Rituals of bonding masked acts of grooming, justified as tradition. The lines between devotion, duty, and exploitation were deliberately blurred until they disappeared. Even the language used to describe these bonds reveals the manipulation. Writers like Plutarch praised them as noble, a higher form of love that elevated both boy and man. But this framing disguised the coercion inherent in the system. The boys were too young, too dependent, and too vulnerable to resist. By cloaking exploitation in the rhetoric of honor, The Spartans transformed what should have been condemned into something celebrated. The physical training of the agoge reinforced this imbalance. Boys were starved, beaten, and humiliated, all under the supervision of their mentors. Pain was reframed as progress, suffering as strength. If a boy cried, it was weakness. If he submitted, it was loyalty. Through this constant reinforcement, the boys were taught that endurance of abuse was proof of manhood. Their identities were shaped not only by discipline, but by silence that concealed their suffering behind the myth of brotherhood. The festivals revealed this most starkly. During the rites at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, boys were whipped until their skin tore and blood ran freely while crowds cheered. Older warriors stood watching, ensuring the boys endured. Some youths even died on the altar, sacrificed in ceremonies that were framed as proof of their courage. This spectacle was called tradition, yet it was little more than ritualized cruelty, sanctioned by the state and applauded by society. And so the cycle continued. The boy, once exploited, would one day become the mentor, repeating the same rituals upon another generation. What was inflicted on him was justified as necessary, and in turn, he would pass it on. In this way, exploitation became self-perpetuating, disguised as education, immortalized as culture. To later admirers of Sparta, these practices were either ignored or idealized. Philosophers praised the devotion of Spartan warriors, glossing over how that devotion was manufactured. Modern admirers of Spartan toughness celebrate their endurance, never asking what horrors forged it. The story of brotherhood lives on, while the truth of exploitation remains hidden. This is the haunting reality. The legendary Spartan warrior, the image of courage and strength, was shaped not only by discipline and training, but by a system that normalized coercion as loyalty. The myth of brotherhood was a mask. Beneath it lay scars of abuse, ritualized and repeated until they became invisible. And yet, this system was more than cultural custom. It was a deliberate tool of the state, designed to control boys from childhood, to sever family ties, and to replace them with loyalty to their mentors, and ultimately to Sparta itself. To understand the true nature of Spartan power, we must now look beyond the rituals of the barracks and examine how the state codified these practices, turning private bonds into instruments of political control. The agoge was not merely a training system, it was the machinery of Spartan control. From the moment a boy was taken from his family at age 7, his life was no longer his own. Every step, every breath, every bond was engineered by the state to ensure obedience. What looked like discipline from the outside was, in truth, social programming, a way to create warriors whose loyalty lay not with their parents, nor even with themselves, but with Sparta alone. The first act of control was separation. By stripping boys from their families, the state severed the natural bonds of love and protection, replacing them with dependence on their assigned mentors. These older warriors, presented as role models, became both guardians and enforcers. Their approval was the only safety a boy could find. The rituals of brotherhood disguised the truth. The state had weaponized intimacy, binding boys through admiration, fear, and dependency. The agoge then reinforced this submission through relentless cruelty. Boys were deliberately starved, so they would learn to steal, and beaten savagely if caught. They were forced to march barefoot in the cold, sleep on reeds, and endure whippings so brutal that some died under the lash. All of this was cloaked in the rhetoric of discipline. In reality, it was systematic conditioning. Suffering was reframed as patriotism. Obedience was redefined as survival. But perhaps the most insidious control lay in how the state turned exploitation into duty. The intimate relationships between older warriors and boys were not hidden, they were endorsed. Spartan leaders claimed such bonds fostered courage, loyalty, and unity on the battlefield. This official sanction erased any distinction between mentorship and coercion, turning what should have been condemned into something celebrated. By enshrining it as tradition, the state ensured silence. To speak against it was not only shameful, it was treason against Sparta itself. The manipulation extended beyond childhood. As boys became men, they carried forward the same rituals, the same scars, and the same silence. In this way, the system perpetuated itself, generation after generation. Every new warrior was both a victim of control and an agent of it, ensuring the cycle continued unbroken. What began as exploitation became culture. What began as cruelty became law. Sparta's rulers understood the power of spectacle. The public festivals, where boys were whipped before cheering crowds, were not only religious rituals, but propaganda. They sent a clear message. Pain was glory, suffering was strength, and loyalty to Sparta was worth more than life itself. The screams of children became the soundtrack of Spartan identity, a reminder to all citizens and to conquered peoples that the state demanded total submission. This culture of fear also extended to the helots, the enslaved majority who worked the land. The same state that conditioned Spartan boys through cruelty also unleashed boys upon the helots. In the infamous Cryptia, young warriors were sent into the countryside armed with daggers, ordered to murder helots at night as a test of stealth and ruthlessness. Officially, it was framed as a rite of passage. In reality, it was legalized terror, an institution that bound boys to the state through blood. By intertwining loyalty with violence, Sparta ensured its warriors were not merely soldiers, but instruments of control. Their lives were scripted from childhood, their bonds weaponized, their identities fused with the machinery of the state. The brutality was not random, it was calculated. Every act of suffering had a purpose, to produce men who could not imagine life outside Sparta, men who equated cruelty with duty and silence with honor. And yet, the myth endured. Ancient admirers spoke of Spartan courage, never questioning the methods that produced it. Modern culture romanticizes their discipline, forgetting that it was built on exploitation of the young, the weak, and the enslaved. The legend of Sparta's invincibility hides the truth that its warriors were forged not only in battle, but in rituals of fear carefully crafted by the state. This is the real power of the Spartan system. It disguised control as tradition, violence as loyalty, and exploitation as brotherhood. It turned children into soldiers, intimacy into politics, and suffering into pride. And in doing so, it ensured that the darker truths of Sparta were buried beneath the glittering myth of heroism. But myths cannot silence reality forever. To uncover the full picture, we must leave the state's machinery of control and turn our gaze to the lives of those most affected. The boys themselves. What did it mean to live every day under this system? To wake each morning in barracks filled with fear and rivalry? To grow up knowing that survival depended on silence? For Spartan boys, daily life was not a childhood. It was an ordeal. From the moment they entered the agoj at 7 years old, innocence ended. Their days were regimented into cycles of hunger, fear, and obedience, all carefully designed to strip away individuality and replace it with the steel of the state. To outsiders, this training created heroes. To the boys themselves, it created a world where survival was the only measure of worth. The day often began before sunrise, with the boys summoned from their reed beds, rough mats that offered little comfort. Their clothes were minimal, sometimes only a single cloak, regardless of the season. Winter brought biting winds, yet they were forbidden shoes. Endurance was taught not in words, but in cold skin and shivering bodies. Breakfast, if it came at all, was meager, a thin broth or scraps. Hunger was constant, deliberate. They were expected to steal food to fill their stomachs, but if caught, they were beaten mercilessly. The lesson was not to avoid theft, but to perfect deception, to become predators in both body and mind. Discipline was absolute. Older boys, often in their late teens, commanded the younger, enforcing Spartan law with fists and whips. Any mistake, a crooked line in drills, A moment of hesitation in obedience was punished swiftly. Bruises and welts became as common as breath. The boys were taught to endure pain without flinching, to swallow their screams as proof of strength. Tears were weakness. Silence was survival. Education, too, reflected this harsh philosophy. Reading and writing were taught only minimally, enough to serve the state's needs. Far more time was devoted to reciting war songs, memorizing laws, and practicing physical endurance. Wrestling, running, and mock combat filled their hours. Each drill reinforced that they were not individuals, but pieces of a larger machine, instruments of Spartan power. Even in play, cruelty lingered. Games often ended in blood, with boys pushed beyond exhaustion for the amusement of their elders, and then came the rituals of intimacy, the bonds with older warriors framed as mentorship. A boy might be chosen by a soldier decades older, expected to admire him, serve him, and submit to his authority. To the Spartans, this was called brotherhood, a relationship meant to instill loyalty and courage. But for the boys, it blurred into coercion, into acts they could neither refuse nor escape. The line between devotion and exploitation was erased, leaving scars that could not be spoken aloud. Festivals were the most public display of this world. At the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, boys were lined up for ritual whippings, blood spilling as the crowd watched. Some collapsed, others died, yet the spectacle was celebrated as proof of Spartan toughness. Parents watched in silence, pride and horror mingling as their children were beaten for the gods and the state. For the boys, it was a lesson burned into their skin. Pain was glory, suffering was duty, and survival was honor. The barracks offered no escape. At night, boys huddled together for warmth, whispering fears they could never share aloud. Rivalries often erupted, fueled by the constant competition for approval. Friendships were fragile, trust risky. Every boy knew that tomorrow, his closest companion might be his harshest rival. Even in their moments of laughter, the shadow of punishment loomed. Yet some adapted. A few learned to wield the system for their own gain, currying favor with mentors, excelling in combat, rising above their peers. These boys became leaders within the agog, inflicting the same cruelty they had once endured. The cycle reinforced itself. Victims transformed into enforcers, ensuring the machinery of Spartan discipline never faltered. Daily life was not without moments of pride. To survive a whipping without crying, to steal food without being caught, to impress a mentor, these became badges of honor. In a world where pain was constant, endurance itself was victory. But beneath the pride lay trauma. Childhood had been erased, replaced with scars both visible and hidden. This was the paradox of Spartan boyhood, celebrated as the foundation of courage, but built on suffering too deep to name. The glory of Sparta's warriors was inseparable from the agony of its children. And while history remembers the men who stood at Thermopylae, it often forgets the boys who bled in the shadows long before they ever carried a shield. To uncover the full story, we must step beyond the barracks and festivals, beyond daily routines, into the way history itself has buried these truths. For the final secret of Sparta lies not only in what they did, but in how their legacy was rewritten, their darkest traditions polished into myths of heroism that still endure today. Sparta's image has endured for over 2,000 years, shining like polished bronze. From the battlefield of Thermopylae to the pages of modern history books, Spartans are remembered as paragons of courage and discipline, an elite warrior society that valued honor above all else. Hollywood glorifies them. Philosophers admired them, and even modern militaries invoke their name to inspire toughness. Yet the true legacy of Sparta is not the one carved in marble or painted on cinema screens. It is the forbidden legacy, the reality buried beneath layers of myth, propaganda, and national pride, a reality woven from exploitation, cruelty, and silence. The rewriting of Sparta's story began in antiquity itself. Writers like Xenophon and Plato admired the discipline of the agog, presenting it as the ultimate model of civic education. They praised the bonds between older warriors and boys, describing them in lofty terms as mentorship, devotion, even love. What they did not emphasize, or chose to ignore, was the coercion embedded in those bonds, the lack of choice, the silencing of suffering. Their accounts reframed exploitation as nobility, disguising control as virtue. In this way, the darker truths of Spartan life were softened from the start. Later admirers carried the myth forward. During the Renaissance, European thinkers looked to Sparta as a model of order and simplicity. In the 19th and 20th centuries, nationalist and authoritarian regimes hailed Sparta as proof that discipline and sacrifice could produce invincible societies. Fascist leaders openly admired its ruthless efficiency, its willingness to sacrifice the individual for the collective. They saw the legend, not the scars beneath. The exploitation of children, the silencing of women, the cruelty toward the helots, all were erased in favor of a gleaming statue of discipline and unity, and Hollywood polished the myth even further. In films like 300, Spartan warriors are portrayed as flawless heroes, their bodies sculpted, their loyalty unquestionable, their deaths noble. The brutality of the agoge is hinted at, but never shown for what it truly was. A system that broke children to remake them as tools of the state. The rituals of intimacy between men and boys are erased altogether, replaced by an image more palatable to modern audiences. The blood, the coercion, the forbidden practices, all sacrificed on the altar of entertainment. But archaeology and scholarship whisper truths that myth cannot silence. Excavations at sites tied to Spartan rituals reveal altars stained with blood, remnants of sacrifices, and accounts of festivals where children were whipped to death in the name of the gods. Ancient testimonies, often overlooked, describe how boys were subjected to pain, hunger, and exploitation, all reframed as tradition. These are not inventions of enemies, but fragments of reality buried beneath centuries of admiration. The forbidden legacy of Sparta forces us to confront a haunting paradox. How could a society so admired for its heroism also normalize practices so disturbing? The answer lies in the nature of myth itself. Civilizations remember what flatters them and bury what shames them. Just as Rome celebrated its law while hiding its cruelty in the Colosseum, just as the Ottomans polished their palaces while concealing the terror of the harem, so too has Sparta been remembered for its shields while its scars were forgotten. The myth of Spartan perfection endures because it serves a purpose. It offers a simple story, that discipline creates greatness, that sacrifice leads to immortality, that warriors forged in suffering are heroes without blemish. It is a story that inspires but also deceives. For the cost of that greatness was borne by children stripped of innocence, by boys broken into silence, by lives consumed in rituals disguised as brotherhood. The glory of Sparta was real, but it was paid for in blood no one wishes to remember. Modern culture continues to sanitize this truth. School books mention the agoge as if it were merely rigorous training. Films show Spartans as noble defenders, never as traumatized products of systemic exploitation. Even academics sometimes hesitate, framing Spartan practices as cultural quirks rather than abuses. In this way, the forbidden legacy is buried again and again, hidden beneath the polished myth of courage, and yet the bones of truth remain, the scars of boys whipped at Artemis Orthia, the echoes of rituals that blurred loyalty with coercion, the silences in ancient texts where suffering was too obvious to ignore, but too dangerous to condemn. These fragments remind us that history is not clean, not heroic, not free of shadows. The forbidden legacy of Sparta is a warning that behind every myth of perfection lies a reality of pain. It also forces us to question ourselves. Why do we still admire Sparta so fervently? Why do modern militaries invoke its name? Why do films celebrate its warriors? Why do nations seek to model its discipline? Perhaps because the myth is easier than the truth. It is easier to celebrate. shields and spears than to acknowledge the cries of children. It is easier to remember courage at Thermopylae than to confront the rituals of exploitation that shaped those warriors long before they carried a sword. The forbidden legacy is not meant to erase Sparta's courage, but to complete the picture. The Spartans were extraordinary fighters, their discipline unmatched, their sacrifice undeniable, but their strength came at a cost too heavy to ignore. By remembering only the glory, we betray the silence of those who suffered. By honoring only the myth, we bury the truth deeper. And so, we end where we began, with the shields and spears. They gleam in our imagination, symbols of courage and defiance. But behind every shield was a boy who had been starved, beaten, coerced, and conditioned until he could no longer cry. Behind every spear was a childhood erased, a scar hidden, a secret buried. This is the legacy that history tries to hide. Not a legend of perfection, but a reminder that even the most celebrated societies carry shadows too dark to face. The forbidden legacy of Sparta is not locked in the past. It is a mirror held to the present, warning us to question the myths we still glorify. For if a society as brutal as Sparta can be remembered as noble, how many other civilizations, even our own, have polished their darkness into legends of light?